Prospect House Media.
And now, prepare yourself for the only weekly podcast you won't want to miss. Welcome to the Ameritocracy Show with Troy Edgar, live from our studios in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C.
Everybody, I am Troy Edgar and welcome to the Ameritocracy Show. Thank you for tuning in and checking it out. It is greatly appreciated. This podcast examines the conditions for personal and economic growth and opportunity across America. This week, I traveled to Key West, Florida and met with U.S. Coast Guard Rear Admiral Mark Fedor at the Joint Interagency Task Force South headquarters, or better known as JIATF South. Mark and I served together in Washington, D.C. when I was the Chief Financial Officer at the Department of Homeland Security. JIAT South is a Department of Defense task force that reports to the U.S. Southern Command in Doral, Florida. As Mark discusses, JIAT South is charged with the mission to stop illicit drug, human, and weapons trafficking and dismantle transnational criminal organizations, or TCOs. His organization includes key U.S. military, law enforcement, and intelligence agencies, as well as 20 partner nations. In this episode, Admiral Fedor talks about his military career, leadership, and his perspective on transnational organized crime. He addresses the responsibility of taking over a command and a consideration that you should have in each role you are assigned on the road to leadership. Over his 32-year career in the Coast Guard, he talks about his 12 years at sea and partnering with his wife, Amy, to find an important balance between his military role and the important role as a husband and a father of four. I would like to thank Admiral Fedor for the invitation to speak at the JIAT South Southernmost Symposium in Key West this last week and acknowledge Major Stephen Taylor and Tony Varner for their support and assistance. I hope you enjoy. Hello, Admiral Fedor. How are you doing?
Hey, good, Troy. It's great to see you, and welcome to Key West, the Conch Republic.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It's good to be down here again. I really appreciate the opportunity to meet with you today.
Yeah, no, we're looking forward to it, and I appreciate doing the podcast with you, and we look forward to your conversation with the team later today.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I came down about a year ago for your change of command, and you and I had worked together up in Washington, D.C. It's interesting about the Coast Guard, and I've talked about this with Admiral Day too, is that previous Navy guy, the Navy kind of had two paths. They have a kind of a line path and a staff. And so line officers work their way up and through, and they can take control of the ship. They can lead the Coast Guard in total, or the Navy. And in the Coast Guard, you and I came across kind of an interesting scenario where you came and actually was the CFO for the Coast Guard,
right?
And where the Coast Guard entrusts their leaders and treats them as executives in the Fortune 500, where you have to do tours of duty in different areas.
Right.
And I think really early on, it was a great opportunity for you and I to work together and to kind of start taking on a couple different things. Everything's from financial systems modernization to building Coast Guard cutters.
Right. No, I think it's the Coast Guard is a unique organization because the spectrum of our authorities is so broad that we become a little bit of a jack of all trades. You do specialize in certain areas, and for me, it was going to sea on cutters. We call it being a cutterman, and so that is a great path, and it really gives you a solid understanding of the service. But as you get more senior in the organization, the priority really becomes leadership. And when I met you, I had a previous budgeting job as an 03, 04 in the Coast Guard. And the Commandant looked at me and said, now that you're a flag officer, I want you to be the Chief Financial Officer. Now, in the private sector, that's a huge job with a lot of credentialing that goes up there. And for us, he said it's more about leadership. And I trust your judgment and to use the smart people who have all that credentialing that work for you to get the best answers. And that's how I ended up in that position.
Well, it was interesting is, I do come from the corporate side and done the CFO route and a lot of consulting. And The thing that I noticed, across DHS, the Coast Guard being one component of 23, but the only military component and the only area or group outside the military that's not in the DoD.
Right.
Very unique battles that we were fighting, and the leadership, as the commandant would say, was really critical. One of the big things that I think you and I took on early on was the readiness budget for all of the Coast Guard. And it was funny because your experience as a cutterman, as you put it, and we're going to get to some of the awesome experiences that you've had. I had to make a lot of trips over to the White House and OMB to talk about this and some of the operational descriptions of what the money for readiness would go to.
Right.
And for the Coast Guard too, I think in that job, before we get to your current job, was that the Coast Guard really kind of missed out on a lot of the readiness funds that the normal Department of Defense were getting at a much higher percentage. And you said many missions, I think 11 statutory missions. And of the 11, one of the most important ones, and something I'm sure we're going to talk about today, is law enforcement and being able to get out there, and the drug interdiction and and a lot of stuff having to do with the migration and human smuggling and all that. So Mark, if you wouldn't mind, you got to DC. That's where you and I kind of came in contact. I think you have about 32 years in the Coast Guard.
Right.
And could you give us a leading up to getting into the Coast Guard, the academy, et cetera, up to today?
Sure. So going through high school, I was born in New York City, but then my dad was transferred to Bristol, Connecticut, which if you don't know Bristol, it's the home of ESPN, but this is pre-ESPN days. So it is very much a blue-collar town, lots of opportunities to get into trouble. And I wasn't a perfect kid growing up, but I had two things going for me. I did pretty well in school and did pretty well in sports. And I saw a lot of my friends going down a path where I knew was going to lead to trouble. And so I knew if I needed to do something differently. And I looked around. We didn't have a lot of money to go to college with. I remember my mom telling me, she's like, you should look into the military. And I thought about enlisting. I had some teachers that said, hey, your grades are good enough. Why don't you try applying to an academy? And didn't know anything about it. And I applied to both the Naval Academy and the Coast Guard Academy. And the reason I settled on the Coast Guard Academy was I knew I wanted to be in the military. Needed some structure in my life as I went forward. But the idea of law enforcement really energized me. This is maybe a little bit of the days of Miami Vice for some of us our age. I might remember that and that kind of lifestyle. And sure enough, my first tour of duty after I graduated was in Miami on my first ship. So you were immersed in living the dream in that environment.
So you get into the Coast Guard, and at first, your assignment is in Miami. Your career, like I said, we're going to talk about some of the interesting assignments commanding, but you had many years till you were actually commanding. But let's talk a little bit about lead up to the James and the Mohawk.
Right. So when you first graduate from the Coast Guard Academy, at that time, everyone was sent to sea. And it was really a good thing, so everyone knew what it felt like to be cold, tired, hungry, a little bit seasick. You had that kind of experience across the fleet. We're not able to do that anymore because we have more people in the service and not enough literally racks on the ships where people could sleep. But for me, it was a great experience, and I really enjoyed being part of a team. It's a bond that you make. I call it a shipmate bond that is unlike anything else that you might experience in the private sector, because you are in a space where you are out there on a ship, hundreds, maybe thousands of miles away, and a lot of times it's just you. If something were to happen on that ship, you have to deal with it, whether you have to fight the ship, whether you're fighting a fire on the ship, whatever it might be. There's no police department or fire department to call. It's all on you. And I love that. I love that environment of being part of something bigger than yourself. And I just thought to myself, if I can continue to do this cutter career, that's what I want to do.
So you work through all these different commands. You've done liaison work on Capitol Hill. You've done all of these really kind of very interesting assignments. Some of them on the surface from a non-Coast Guard person looks like mentoring to get you ready for commands. I almost kind of see it before you're actually having to get kind of in the thick of it. Talk a little bit about the Mohawk and the James. We'll talk about the James as some stories, but I would just tell you, being in the Navy and being on submarines, you realize like your life is in everybody's hands. When you're out there, you're off the grid, and whatever happens out there, and you when you come up through the service, they also show you some of the worst things that can happen to prepare you for it. You go to schools to live in a condition where they'll flood you out in the middle of in a room, and you're trying to see if you can keep your calm. Talk about when you first take command of your first ship and the feeling when you get on there.
Yeah. So one thing that certainly helps you growing up in the cutter community is those mentors that you mentioned, but also it's kind of understanding that full responsibility that you're embracing. And it's one thing to be on the ship, but when you're in command, it can be a lonely place because you realize all these lives, you're not just responsible for the mission, you're responsible for the lives of everyone on board and how that goes forward. And so as I grew up, I was glad, and I still make this recommendation to a lot of junior officers, earn your sea credibility, whatever your operational specialty is, do that first. Get that sea cred. A lot of people want to go do what they perceive to be the sexy tours, like a congressional liaison or this or that. It's like, hey, earn your operational street cred, and then you'll be even better in those jobs. So I think that gave me a really good understanding of shipboard mentality and how you get things done in that environment. So I felt relatively prepared for my command. So I was able to, I served on 6 ships. I had 3 commands. The first one was a small patrol boat, a 110-foot patrol boat called the Monomoy out of Woods Hole, Massachusetts. And in that environment, we do a lot of search and rescue. We actually did deploy to Puerto Rico to do a lot of counter-drug efforts too. But there's one sea story I'll give you on the Monomoy where I really learned what it was like to be in command. So it was in the winter. They call storms up there, they call hurricanes up there nor'easters in the winter. And we had to go out in one of these nor'easters to rescue a fisherman who was disabled. And so we're on our way out there, and it's a 110-foot ship where the captain sits on the bridge. You're about 15 feet above the water line. And I remember sitting in my chair, and it's really rough, and I see the wave tops going by me. And you're just like, wow, this is going to be dicey, snow blowing in sideways. And I was in my own head on the bridge thinking, like, how am I going to execute this tow? How am I going to save these people on this ship? There was a lot of I was thinking and I was so thankful. My chief, you have one chief on board who's a senior enlisted member, comes up and he says, hey, Skipper, the crew's pretty nervous. The weather's bad. It's getting cold. It's dark out. I think you really need to talk to them. And I was so glad he said that because I was caught up in my own head about what am I going to do? And I forgot the 16 other people that were on the ship who had to execute that mission. That was a critical lesson for me. And I went down there to the mess deck where they were all sitting. And when I first went down, their eyes were as wide as pie plates. And as we talked about, here's how we're going to do the mission. Here's how we're going to mitigate risk. Their eyes got to return to normal size. And we were able to execute the mission successfully at that point. But it really made me understand that first tour. And so I was a lieutenant in 03, what command was all about. It's not so much about me. It's about the team.
Yeah. Sitting back and seeing leaders like yourself come into an organization, sometimes it is just trying to be normal and breaking it down into the pieces, and I think that becomes like, then they get out of their head and they start kind of following you through that process.
Right. You have to set that vision for them, what you're trying to accomplish. So every time I would go into a command position, including here, try to put out what we call a commander's intent. Here are the goals of what we are going to try to accomplish. And in addition to that, my leadership philosophy. And my leadership philosophy has stayed the same since that first command. It's be a professional, be a leader, be a good shipmate. And it's those 3 things and kind of some subcomponents of each one of those. But I've stayed with those my whole career. And when I went from Monomoy and went to MOHAWK and then finally to James, and even here, I use the same leadership philosophy.
So MOHAWK is stationed here. I've seen this down here the last time I was here.
Right.
And it's funny is that I within Division 7 in Miami, we've got Admiral Schofield, and one of his staff, guy I reached out to recently, I think Beasley. I'm trying to remember the name, but anyway, he reached out to me and said, I served with Admiral Fedor on the MOHAWK, and they it was an experience that he loved. But so that was it here in Key West when you were here?
It was. So it was here in Key West, and we fell in love with the community. This is a great place to live. The ship has a great reputation, and so when I came to MOHAWK, I felt prepared for the mission, and we ended up working for my current command, JIATF South here,
Oh,
quite
wow.
a few times. And one of the best patrols that we had was we were able to interdict 2 what we call drug submarines. And there's one that's right in front of JIATF South. We were able to catch 2 in the Caribbean within a matter of about a month. It was just one of these anomalies that happened in the drug smuggling world. We were the right ship in the right time.
Wow.
And it was just such an event. I call interdicting one of those like the Super Bowl
Yeah.
of law enforcement.
Yeah.
Because they're hard to find, really tough to see, and they're carrying literally tons of cocaine. And we were able to do that, for 2 during one patrol. And I think a lot of people who served at that time that I served alongside with really will take that for the rest of their lives. It's a great memory.
Yeah, it's interesting is spending a lot of time on the ocean. It's boring out there sometimes. I mean, so there's a
It
lot.
can be.
You're out there
Yeah.
for a long time, and like you said, when something, especially when your mission starts kicking in and it becomes real.
Right.
You hate to say it's quote luck because it's bad to have any of that stuff out there, but the
Right.
reality is that that's what your purpose is, and
Yeah.
so when you are purpose and the mission and meet the opportunity, it's good to see what your team can do
It
out
is.
there.
It is. And I think it's important. I always try to stress the importance of every job on board so people felt like they had a purpose, even if we weren't busy operationally, what they were doing. One thing I would always do is go into the scullery, which is where you clean the dishes.
Oh, I've been there.
You've been there. I've been there. And I would remind those folks, and I'd say, hey, I know you're probably not thrilled to be in here right now, but just know that this job is important because if you don't do it properly and disinfect all this equipment, people are going to get sick and we're not going to be able to do our mission. And you just try to there is value in every single thing you do on the ship and really any unit you're involved in. And if you can convince people of that and how they contribute to the broader mission, you got a more motivated crew.
So this would not be a proper interview unless we talked about the James.
Okay.
When I was the CFO for DHS, I really had a great opportunity to work with all the different components, but the Coast Guard very specifically. And, where the Coast Guard is very smart between yourself and at that time the Commandant Admiral Schultz is he's like, hey, take the money guy with you, so he understands what the mission is, so he can be a little bit more effective and defensive on what we're trying to do. And so I never missed the opportunity when given to go out and see certain operations. And so I had an opportunity to go to the James. And as soon as I got on board, I was on with yourself, and we're walking through, and I just noticed that there was just a tremendous amount of respect. And I'm like, wow. I mean, this guy, the thing I know about ships is that, and submarines is after 2 or 3 years, everybody's changed over.
Right.
And so, the time that you had been on had been quite before. So there was some historical element of what you had done. We got a tour of the ship, and we ended up going through some of the operational stuff and some of it classified. And when we started getting into some of the missions, I remember looking at the statistics for what the James was responsible for. And then I started to they actually have an area where you can see the statistics that they've it's sort of like, if you, Top Gun, the number of kills, there was like a certain area you could look up and see what this ship has been through. Right. And I look up there and it's like, oh my God, that was the time most of the, not most, but a lot of the big ones were when you were there. Can you talk a little bit about your time on the James and that special moment? Because I think that was a demarcation that even in Washington, D.C., people talk about that before I even knew you.
Yeah, so the James is one of our national security cutters, and they are our newest ships, really state-of-the-art. I often equate them to, it has a lot of the same sensors and weapon system as a DDG, except for the missiles. We don't have missiles on board, don't need them, but a lot of the same command control type of equipment, the sensors to do that. So it is a leap beyond what we've traditionally operated. And so I was luckily the second commanding officer on James. The first one had to do a lot of the testing to bring it to bear and get it ready to commission at sea. I was able to operate it. And so we felt like the crew who came through that commissioning process felt like, hey, take the gloves off, let's go. And and I was with them. And again, I started with that commander's intent, what we wanted to do. And one of the mottos we came up with was, we own the night. And knowing the mission we were going to get assigned is a lot of this counter drug work. It always happens at night. So you better practice in the night if you want to be good at it. And other military services and branches do similar things. But we did that. We had it painted around a few different places, and we practiced to it so that when we were asked to do those missions, we were ready to go. And whenever we brought a detachment in, whether it was an aviation detachment or some law enforcement assistance, we brought them into the loop. We kind of gave them a big bear hug and said, I don't care where you came from, you're part of the James now. And I think they appreciated that. They really felt like they were part of the team. And the things we were able to do was really a combination of the team being motivated and pairing that up with capability. And you can see when you do that, you can achieve some outstanding results. And I don't take credit for that as much as the team did it. And we had some strong leaders well below me who really made that team atmosphere come together. And for a little while, we did own the night. So.
Yeah, no, it was awesome. You know something, Mark? A lot of people don't really understand the mission. We've talked about the 11 statutory missions, law enforcement being an important one. What's really interesting to me is that we were basically pitching to try and get a $5 billion lift for the Coast Guard readiness. Right. So myself, the commandant, and the secretary at the time for Homeland Security, we were with the OMB director, Russ Vaught, at that time. And we're at the White House, and he, the director kind of pushes his seat back from the table and goes, Troy, seriously. He goes, he had a picture of the U.S. He goes, Coast Guard. And then one of his staff members looked at me and they drew with their finger a circle. Right. The coast, what are you guys doing in, all these different parts of the world? And, you're not law enforcement, you're not intel. It's I remember I had, had some discussions before, because you get prepared for that meeting, of course. Yeah. And, I know National Security Council activities, the principles that I just discussed would go to those meetings, and they would start handing off tasks, and the Coast Guard was at that table, and they were getting those tasks. And I remember as the finance guy, I'm like, who's paying for the gas? Right. It's who's paying for it? Who's setting aside the stuff for that mission and those assignments that, you got 10 other statutory missions, outside of the one that you're getting asked to do. And it's going to lead a little bit into what we're doing here at the Joint Interagency Task Force South, or JIATF, as we call that. Is you realize the Coast Guard, definitely has a lot of missions, and it's pulled in many different directions. And when you talked about your time up in Boston area, you think of the Coast Guard. I know when I was a kid, and it was people getting saved along the shorelines, and in the Coast Guard movies, Kevin Costner's, the whole thing is it's all about trying to get out there, and but it's so much more. Yeah,
it is, and that's the first thing I'd say. The Coast Guard will always be there to do the search and rescue mission, and we understand our statutory responsibilities around the coast. However, when it comes to Homeland Security and national defense, if you think we're going to do that at our borders and be successful, we'll fail. Yep. We need to push Homeland Security and the defense of our borders much further out. And the key area that Coast Guard plays in is, a lot of other nations have more what you would call a Coast Guard than a real Navy. So they can relate to us, because a lot of the nations, whether it's in this hemisphere or even as you're seeing in Indo-Pacific right now, those nations want help with maybe search and rescue, but probably fisheries enforcement, law enforcement, just monitoring and surveilling their own exclusive economic zones or territorial seas. So they can relate a lot to the Coast Guard more than they could maybe to a destroyer, certainly an aircraft carrier. They just, it's hard to even comprehend. So the Coast Guard fills that void. And the other benefit of us is, as you said earlier, we are one of the armed services, but we sit in the Department of Homeland Security because we have law enforcement authority. So we used to have a former commandant who used to say, the beauty of the Coast Guard is we are bureaucratically multilingual. We can talk to the sheriff in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, or a admiral in the Philippines. That's right. We can do that in the same day, and we can achieve results in both areas. And I think people on the National Security Council kind of see that Swiss Army knife capability and say, that's someone I can plug in to help solve this problem.
Yeah. Well, and it was leaders like yourself and the previous commandant and the current commandant too, because I watch her. She's awesome, Admiral Fedor. But you got to pay for that too. Right. And I think there's an awareness now of the criticality and the mission out there. let's talk about the JIATF-S, where we're at today. We're in Key West. Describe your organization and maybe put it in the context too of, as a Coast Guard admiral, this is not a full Coast Guard assignment. So if you could just...
So the Joint Interagency Task Force South, JIATF South, we are a subcomponent of U.S. Southern Command. So I report to a 4-star Army general who sits in Miami. She's the combatant commander. So I have learned to say "hua" a lot. That's the Army. You got to make sure I'm on good terms with her. But she is a great leader. She's given me a pretty long leash to execute the mission. I know where my guardrails are, and she says, "Fedor, go," and we've done that. So this place is very unique. My predecessor organization started about 1989, but what it is, it's a military-led organization with a lot of civilian liaisons to it. So all the services represented, except Space Force, maybe we'll recruit one of them, but you have all your major law enforcement entities here, all your major intelligence community. If you think of a 3-letter agency, they're probably down here. But one of the most unique parts is we have 20 different countries that have one or more liaisons who actually sit with us here. So any moment in time, you could walk the halls, you'll run into our DEA LNO, and then I'll run into our Ecuadorian foreign liaison officer. And just bringing them all together, it's a bit like herding cats, and it can be a challenge, but there's so much benefit if you can get all of that going in the same direction. You can really make good things happen. And the mission, the formal mission, is detection and monitoring of illicit narcotics heading towards the United States. But I think that's just a starting point. We really do a lot more than what I would say is drugs on deck, meaning drug bales on the deck of a ship. It's much more than that.
Yeah, and a lot of the activity, like you said, is kind of cross-agency. The coordination. When I looked at like the mission for this organization, I really tried to look at it a year ago when I came down here to kind of understand the assignment. I think of it very similar a bit to NATO. Where NATO's primary mission is military, not drug interdiction, but 30 countries that kind of pitch in, for a common cause. It provides an impetus for discussion. I probably would say that would be the most, and then then it gets into the sticky areas, which is funding and who's contributing, et cetera. But I think what was interesting with that as a comparison to this is that the members have to stay happy, or at least they have to stay in the middle, lukewarm,
Right. That's exactly right.
So what I wanted to talk a little bit about is like with all that partnership that has to happen to the different countries, one of the main missions, like you said, is transnational organized crime. Would you mind giving your perspective of what we call TCO, and just kind of your view of how the mission here kind of feeds into that?
Another part that makes this so unique is I've had to take my Coast Guard hat off. And really, I work for the Department of Defense. I'm on loan for these 2 years to Department of Defense and answer to General Richardson. And the job is, it's about detection and monitoring of narcotics, but really what we're trying to do is help our law enforcement partners dismantle these transnational organized criminal networks. And I talk a lot about, again, not just drugs on deck, because if you think about the threat, these cartels, these transnational organized criminals, they're not just delivering drugs, they're delivering violence, corruption, and instability. And the ramifications of that, as we work with our partner nations, is it erodes the rule of law. It accelerates a lot of irregular migration that we see coming around. It enriches these transnational organized criminals to get involved in other illicit activities, whether it's either illegal fisheries, illegal mining, human trafficking. And from a DoD perspective, all that violence, corruption, and instability creates a permissive environment for malign state actors. That's a nice way of saying China and Russia from taking advantage of any opportunities they have in this hemisphere. So the value we provide the combatant commander is all these nations in this area, they may not be willing right up front to talk about counter PRC efforts because they might have an economic relationship with them, but they're always willing to talk about counter narcotics or counter transnational organized criminals. So we provide access, and we start there, and then you can have broader strategic conversations.
Yeah. So an organization like that, if we kind of talk about managing the leadership and the communication in something as a multi-agency, not only the stakeholders within the U.S. agencies and the military agencies and all these countries, talk a little bit about your leadership style and the communication. I know you personally, and the way you're a straight shooter. The thing I think where you and I definitely resonate, but I think it's hard sometimes because it'll take just one or two times of you quote not being able to be totally straightforward with them for national security reasons while you're trying to build a personal relationship. Talk about that as a leadership style.
This is a unique command. It's the most unique thing I've really ever been a part of it. And a lot of the missions I did at sea were working for JATA South, but now that I've come here, wow, you're behind the curtain, you're seeing everything that goes on. So, you kind of nailed it in terms of how do you bring this kind of diverse group together and get them going in the same direction. So in my leadership style, I've started again with that commander's intent. I made sure everyone, both folks wearing the uniform, but all our partner agencies and our international partners, here's where we're trying to go. And I want your input on that. You are part of this team. And so we put that out there first, but then I'm constantly trying to make sure that our partners who are here willingly, I can't tell the DEA exactly what to do. I can't tell any of the intelligence agencies what to do. But what I try to do is create value for them to be here. Here's the benefit we can provide, big DOD, in this detection and monitoring mission to help you get your mission. So I do that all the time. I'm always trying to find those win-win spots together, and it becomes a multi-Venn diagram because you have a lot of different agencies, and what might sell with one entity might be the polar opposite of this entity. So at the end of the day, I really try to build trust between all these partners. Like, we have to trust each other, especially with information. And you probably saw that a little in DC. A lot of the law enforcement community very hesitant to share some information because they might have to go to court. And there's legitimate reason. They might have to go to court with that. And if it gets corrupted, they might lose that case.
That's right.
So we take a lot of pride in protecting data and building that trust. And it becomes even more complicated when you start talking about some of our international partners. How do you build trust there? And we go to great lengths to make sure that we have trusted relationships across the board. That's critical.
Yeah. Now, the mission is pretty incredible. And like you said, I think the trust over time, trying to kind of keep on that, in the corporate world, when you do, something that I see and, something I'll talk about with your team a little bit later is, in the tech field, there's a big focus on ecosystem, and you can go to market with everybody. But the hard part is, like, you go to market and you show everything you've got for that certain area, and then 2 weeks later you're competing against them to do something where they wanted to go and do that. And so protecting your equities isn't something to be distrustful. It's something that you just got to be smart, and everybody's got to be professional and mature about, like, really kind of what we're doing here. And I think when people start acting like they don't understand how it works when everybody does, that's where the trust breaks down.
It does.
Mark, kind of in closing, as we start to kind of go through, we've covered off a lot of different stuff. Your career, your role within the organization here. We've talked about transnational organized crime and how to fight it. I want to talk a little bit about professional career and family and trying to balance. A little bit of a sea story for between you and I as we were on another one of our trips, and we were down in Charleston, and I remember we had a thing that we needed to do during the day, pretty important. And in the evening, we said, hey, we're all going to get together and have a social in Charleston. And so there was a restaurant, and there was a section of it. And so we're in there. And as we're, enjoying company of everybody and having a couple beers and very relaxing, I noticed these women at the table behind me, and they kept looking at all of the Coast Guard guys in uniform. And pretty soon I started seeing them making eye contact with people at the table. And then pretty soon as I'm sitting there, I stepped away to go to the bathroom. I see one talking to somebody. It might have been you. And so finally, as everybody started kind of filing out, I realized these were your wives. and I remember,
thank goodness, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I was thinking, what, the Coast Guard's got a pretty liberal policy here. It's like, come on, guys. HQ is here.
Right.
But and then it it quickly shifted from a business socialization to really family and getting to know, like, so with your wife, Amy, I started to form a relationship with you on a lot of different levels. But it wasn't unique. The Coast Guard seems to have that ability to kind of, in the Navy, we used to call like the role an ombudsman, somebody that would try to like bring the family element in.
Right.
It always seemed, I was in the 80s, so I'm no slight on the Navy in the modern Navy, but it just seemed a little insincere.
Yeah.
It was like checking it
Artificial,
off, and
right,
it was.
right.
But in the Coast Guard, I was really impressed, and that relationship. And I think about your career of 32 years, and 12 of it being out at sea, based on what I can tell. How do you guys set that up for success?
Yeah, I think as I always, even from a command perspective, I've always said, if your home life isn't good, and everyone has a different home life, what's going on there, but if it isn't stable and productive for you, you're never going to be able to do your job here. So I always thought it was important to make sure, hey, are we talking to families? Are we reaching out? Are we doing command picnics, bringing them in? And any opportunity I have to bring people over to the house or any social events, I'm going to do that, because I think that's important to make the families feel like, hey, I'm part of this too. I'm part of this something bigger than just what my spouse may be doing at that unit. For me personally, it is. I'm very fortunate. My wife, Amy, who we've been married for 30 years, just celebrated our 30th anniversary, and her dad was in the Coast Guard, and he was a cutterman. So I always joke around about she's been in the Coast Guard longer than I have. So she's able to deal with some things, but still, it's not easy. We have 4 kids. Yeah. A lot of that time raising those kids when they were young was when I was out on ships. So she has done, she's the glue in our family. She brings it all together. But I think the key for us has always been communication. So as I've kind of taken different jobs before I've committed to them, we would always have a conversation about, is this the right thing to do? If I go to sea, this means I'm going to be gone 6 months of the year. Are we good with that? And we'd always reach a good decision. Well, okay, if you're going to do that, let's make sure we move to an area where I'm comfortable, good schools, and we would have those conversations. And if it meant a longer commute for me going into work, then so be it. If it put her and the family in a better spot. So communications, compromise. So I had some pretty long commutes when I was stationed up in Miami, but it meant the family was in a good area. And if it meant I drove 45 minutes into work, hour to work, so be it. I'm willing to do that. But I think that's the key. And I've seen a lot of people get themselves into trouble with their families and resulting in divorce when they were only thinking about their career and weren't having that conversation with their spouse to really say, can we do this? How would we make this work? And I think one of the hardest conversations we had was, we always said we would never be geo-bachelor. That means kind of military term for when one person is the family stays in one location and the military member goes and serves somewhere else. So when I was in Charleston on the James, we were all together, and my next job was going to be working for Admiral Schultz as his chief of staff. And so a great opportunity. I had my 2 older boys who were going into their junior and senior years in high school. They were really doing well in Charleston, and so we were debating, do we uproot them, move to D.C.? I knew I was going to a very busy job where I wasn't going to have a lot of free time anyway. And we kind of talked through it, and we reached that conclusion. We've always said we'd never geo-batch, but maybe this is the right time to do it. And we said, okay. I think it's the best thing for the 2 older boys, and it wasn't fun being separated from that. And I got home every 2 weeks or so, and they couple leave periods. But that was a tough 2 years. But I look back on it, and as we both talk about it, we think it was the right decision for the kids because our 2 older boys are really doing well, and I think it gave them a little bit of stability. Not every military family can make that kind of decision. We had a little bit more income where I could afford an apartment, in addition to paying our mortgage in the house in Charleston. Not everyone can do that, but I was very fortunate that we were able to make it work, and I think it was the best thing for the family. So communications and compromise.
Yeah. No, I live that geo-bachelor thing, but I think that a relationship has to mature to that level. And I would say too, just it's a very tough one, but it becomes a different relationship too. And I know on my side, very successful. Almost like you look forward. It made the times that you were together very special.
It does.
Being able to go through. I guess in closing, Admiral Fedor, if you message to the listeners, maybe from a career perspective or a personal perspective, or maybe the mission here at JIATF-S, any closing message or anything that you would like to kind of put out there for the listeners?
Yeah. Just in terms of JIATF South, I think it's one of those hidden gems that we refer to it, but a lot of other people do, as the gold standard for interagency and international cooperation. I'm very proud of that. And I feel like in my 2 years here, I'm the caretaker of that, and I want to continue to build that. And in fact, that's one of our goals we talk about, is enhancing our reputation and the value that others derive from us. So that's on that part of it. In terms of career advice, I would just offer people, be true to who you are. Don't try to change who you are based on your position. I recognize, as a 2-star admiral, I'm in charge of this command, but I'm still Mark Fedor. And I want to be a person that other folks can relate to. I know where my role is and what I need to do, but I don't want to constantly be wearing my stars in every conversation I have. I want people to recognize me and be approachable to them. I think that's really important for folks. They need to, hey, I'll make the decisions I need to make, but I need to be approachable and relatable for folks. And I think that helps you build that team atmosphere and that inclusive atmosphere where everyone feels like, hey, I have value here, I'm contributing to the mission. And as we talked about before, it's always encourage folks, take care of your families too. This is such a wonderful place to live here, and even our foreign liaisons that are here, they have their families with them. And so we bring them into the loop as well, and make them feel like a part of the team, because they're away from their homes, thousands of miles away from their home in some instances, and they're living with us. So I want them to feel like you are part of something larger than yourselves, and we'll take care of each other.
Yeah. Well, Mark, this has been very inspirational, and I always love the opportunity to catch up with you.
Yeah.
And I just want to thank you one more time for hosting us here at the base down here in Key West. And, and thank you.
Yes. Troy, thank you again for having us. It's great to catch up, and I look forward to having a beverage with you later tonight. So.
Sounds good, Mark.
Right.
Thank you. Take care.
You.
Thanks again for joining me today on the Ameritocracy Show. Be sure to follow me on social media and our website at troyedgar.com, where you can get more information and sign up for my weekly email. I hope you have a great week.